We know what teams win big, what teams should win big. We got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast. You can catch him on his other channel as well, The Bigger 10, breaking down Big Ten football and specifically, of course, his beloved Maize and Blue. Steve, how you doing today?
Always good to talk to you, Mark. Thanks for having me, brother. Good to see you.
Absolutely. Love smart college football discussion. We do our best. I can't promise that, but that's at least the aim, the goal, and the mission every day with guys like you. All right. Again, it's a Michigan podcast, and I am fortunate enough to get over there every Tuesday to cut a segment with Steve called the 10-Minute War. If you don't know what that is, look it up. All right. Let's get to your team talent rankings here. Total team talent rankings. I got to get the T's all in order right there. They're the ratings of and you're going to do a much better job of this and more succinctly break it down in regards to what we're talking about here so the audience can follow along.
Yeah, a few years ago, I started noticing in my preseason college football preview, and then I wanted to get involved in college football futures, is I noticed there was a missing element that there's just so much specialization now, so many guys that come in as freshmen that are prepared to play, that just deciding how good Alabama and Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, teams that are in that elite tier of recruiters right now, Mark, deciding how good they're going to be based on what we used to do when we were kids, which is go get all the magazines and look at returning starters. It just doesn't cut it anymore. There's too much NFL style of sub-packaging, specializations, early enrollees, some schools bringing in 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 players, and the elite players are so much more prepared to play college football than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. We've seen so many guys as freshmen take their teams to the college football playoff. You think of Jalen Hurts, think of Tua, you think of Jake Fromm, Trevor Lawrence. We went through a streak where 4 years in a row, a team in the playoff, at least one team started a freshman on the offensive line. So I wanted to develop a new metric. A guy like Bill Connolly at ESPN, I have a lot of respect for. I think he does a phenomenal job with analytics in terms of looking at how good teams project to be based on what we know about them. All right, based on how their most recent recruiting class and then returning production. Those are the two main markers in Bill Connolly's projections. Well, there's a missing link there for me, and that is how good could a team still be? You know, those guys that were recruited 1, 2, 3 classes ago that aren't in the most recent recruiting class, who maybe haven't played yet. How good are those guys? You think of DeAndre Swift averaging 7 yards a carry behind Nick Chubb. He kind of just forgotten about. Zaire White averaging about 6 yards a carry behind DeAndre Swift at Georgia. So that's what I want to measure is the total amount of raw material that each Power 5 school has on the roster to be molded by a coach. And obviously, the more talent, the larger the margin for error. It doesn't mean if you score low in this, you won't have a good team. Iowa State is not even in my top 25 of most talented rosters. But when you look at what they're bringing back, they're going to be a preseason top 10 team. But that's also a program. They get 2 or 3 key injuries. They go from 9-3, 10-2 to 6-6, 7-5. So that's what I wanted to see. Who's potential for a special year, a breakthrough year? And so I developed this thing called the Team Total Talent Ratings, where I go back and I look at just the previous 4. I do not look at the fifth years unless they factor into the depth chart, because fifth-year seniors just don't matter in college football at the Power 5 level the way that they used to. So if they don't factor prominently in the depth chart, they're just taking up a slot. I don't factor them in. I look at the last 4 recruiting classes according to the 24/7 Sports composite of the major 3 recruiting services. And if you're a 5-star, you get 5 points, 4-star, 4 point in all 3 of those classes, or 4 of those classes. And then I've gone through all of the transfer portal. So what we'll talk about today is all the latest transfer portal news as of about an hour ago. I've even factored in everything we know so far about what we're calling, I guess, super seniors, the guys taking the COVID extra year. And these are going to be the updated numbers post signing days, both December and February, of who are the top 25 most talented rosters in the country. And again, not best teams. It's not a power rating, but it helps me to factor in a power rating. And I'll put those out later this summer. But early on, I want to know what is a team's potential, because I'm trying to get out ahead of the marketplace. College football futures are already out, for example. I've already wagered on Georgia 10-1 to win the national championship. Not necessarily because I think Georgia's going to win the national championship, but because you're giving me the second most talented roster in the country with a first-round draft choice at quarterback returning, and you're giving me 10-1 odds. Same reason I bet the Buccaneers 12-1. I didn't actually think the Buccaneers were going to win the Super Bowl the day after Thanksgiving when I bet them 12-1. I just knew after they fell to 7-5, I'm going to wait, watch the odds. You're going to give me Tom Brady set 12-1 odds? I'm going to take my chances. So you bet numbers, not necessarily teams. And so what I want to do is get ahead of soft markets where early on, think of LSU 3 years ago. Remember, their win total was 6, and that team ended up winning a New Year's Six Bowl and set the stage for the national championship team. That's what I'm looking for, soft spots in the market, because a team's roster says either A, they're going to be way overrated based on what they did last year, or B, way underrated based on what they did last year. And so, and then what I'll do with the next ones, when we get out of spring ball and we start finding out who are the guys that are going to stick around, because after spring, there'll be another spate of transfers when guys realize that they're not going to play a lot. And after I factor all that in, then I'm going to go, and because I wanted to also account for developmental programs that always outplay their recruiting rankings. And so I will go and look at players like a Tanner Morgan at Minnesota. He was the 1,185th recruit when he came out of high school. Back in 2019, he had something like the third or fourth best pass efficiency rating by a Big Ten quarterback ever. All right. So to account for that guy, I give him bonus stars. So 3-star that way overplayed his position was up to a 4 or a 5, because that accounts for progression as you move through the program and develop.
So I got one major problem with this, Steve, and that's I didn't think of it. So that would be the one thing that I don't like about it. So I love that you account for the potential, but you don't downgrade for the 5 stars that have underachieved, and this is why. Because the Tanner Morgans of the world have proven, okay, they're no longer the 2-star guy.
Right.
They're not the 2-star guy anymore. They've thrown 30 touchdowns with 6 picks in a season. He's leading a major program that finished in the top 10 in the country. So he's a different guy than we expected him to be. The 5-star may still turn out to be a 5-star. There were a couple players in the Ohio State linebacking corps this year that were former 5-stars that underachieved based on injuries, getting behind other players, just underachieving as well. But they didn't maybe meet that 5-star qualification, but they turned out to be really good players.
Correct. Yep.
A little bit later. The issue that we have in football.
The reason why I do that, by the way, just since you brought that up, I remember the point of this metric is not to tell me how good teams are. It's to measure. There's other metrics that do that. I'm not going to come up with something better than Bill Connelly has, for example. I'm trying to when I put my power ratings in for this season, and last year my final power ratings, Mark, correctly predicted the winner of every Power 5 conference, and except for Northwestern, I had Notre Dame and Clemson in the championship game. I had USC and Oregon in the championship game. I had Oklahoma and Iowa State in the championship game. Northwestern was the only Power 5 team in a conference championship game last year. My power ratings heading into the season got wrong. So this is not a measure of how good these teams are. This is a measure of how good they could be. So just because a player has met his potential doesn't mean he won't. It just means it's unrealized. And so that's why I don't downgrade them for not reaching their potential yet either.
So the one challenge that we have in football that we don't experience in the other major sports, baseball and basketball, is obviously each position is so different. Whereas in basketball, everybody shoots, everybody dribbles, passes, plays defense, does all those things, rebounds. Baseball, regardless of whether you're comparing a catcher and a center fielder, they bat, they throw, they field the baseball. So for an offensive lineman in particular, with no statistics other than unless they ascend to an all-conference ranking, how do you account for the offensive lineman who was not regarded but has turned into a impact type player?
Well, I'm going to look at a guy, for example, and there's a few of these guys right now in the transfer portal. There's a young man, I think it's Jamar Martin, who is transferring from Tennessee. And I'm trying to remember which school he's going to, but this is a guy that was rated as a 3-star and is not all conference, but Markey started 17 games in the Southeastern Conference. So when he, at the new school he ended up at, I bumped him up to a 4-star. And so that's just a matter of doing my homework. You know, when I move a guy up or down, and I'm not going to catch everybody. There's just too many players. I mean, I spend more time than I should doing it, given how many other jobs I have. But you're still going to have people go. There's a margin for error, like with any kind of sampling, polling, projection. There's always a margin for error. And overall, if I'm within a range, missing on 2 or 3 players on a given team by a point or so won't really throw my metric off that much.
Folks in the live chat, we got Steve for a few minutes here. Leave your comments, questions, anything in there that debate topics that you think we might need to wrestle around with, and I will pick those off if they're reasonable. All right, I see that.
I'll tell you what, Mark, I've got more time than I thought. Let's go till 45. You want to do that?
All right, that'd be beautiful.
Okay.
Would love that. So, the quarterback position, we've talked about this before, the most important position on the field. It should be adjusted in some way in the recruiting rankings because that one Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson can elevate a class like they did, or an entire roster of 4 years that's really good, but maybe not a national championship roster. So do you account for the quarterback position?
In the team total talent ratings, no. But when I form the next framework of my power ratings, yes. What I'll do in the summertime, when I sit down to do my power ratings for my actual predictions, every team based on their power rating will be given a win range within 2 games. And so we get 2 rounds of win totals, some now and then in the spring. And then you'll get like the final round in July when the final win totals come out. With those final ones, I will compile a power rating win total within 2 wins. And I'm looking to see which teams Vegas has outside of the win total range for me. Then those are the ones where I see value. What I'll do with those teams, I'll give everybody, based on the talent they have returning and the schedule they traditionally would play, given their level of competition, I give them a range within 2 wins. And that's the 2 wins, just because some years your schedule may be a little bit tougher than others. In the Big Ten, you might have 5 road games one year, 4 the next. And so that range accounts for some schedule variance. And then if you have an experienced playmaking quarterback returning, so for example, I can tell you right now, because we know so many of the players they have coming back, Iowa State, based on that talent, would be rated as an 8 to 10 win team to me. But because the top line talent is good, but the depth is questionable. But with the return of Brock Purdy, they would then get a bonus win range. They would go from an 8 to 10 win team to a 9 to 11 win team. That's how I account for the importance of the quarterback situation later in the offseason as I'm compiling my projections.
Got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast. So if you're not familiar, please get yourself familiar. You can type it right into the search bar of YouTube, Michigan Podcast. Also got a channel called The Bigger 10, in which he, of course, talks Big Ten football and basketball. All right, the Rod Farbaugh's got a question for you, honing in specifically on Michigan football with J.J. McCarthy. Will he be the week 1 starter, being how he has the most upside of the quarterbacks on the roster? Will likely be gone after 3 years.
If I'm Jim Harbaugh, if it's even close, I'm starting J.J. McCarthy. If Jim Harbaugh is coaching for his job, and if you're going to go 6-6 or 7-5 in year 7, that looks better with the highest rated quarterback recruit the program has had since Chad Henne, or Ryan Mallett. Actually, I forget about him because he transferred out. So this is the highest rated quarterback recruit the program has had since Ryan Mallett. It looks better doing that with him as a true freshman than it does with Joe Milton or Cade McNamara, who have combined now going into this year 7 years in your program. So if I'm Jim Harbaugh, and the other factor too is the presence that McCarthy has. He played a huge role in keeping this recruiting class together when Jim Harbaugh was looking for a job in the NFL. If we're being brutally honest, that's what was going on, despite stories to the contrary. So he kept that class together, helped assemble a lot of that class. He's been committed to Michigan for 2 years. To me, I think he's a culture guy, not just a top prospect, but a guy that wants to be an ambassador for Michigan football. He wants to be a field marshal, not just a quarterback. And so if I'm Jim Harbaugh, if it's close at all, I'm starting J.J. McCarthy.
Now, one aspect of this, in
by
all
the
the
way,
criticism,
can I bring this up about Michigan?
of course.
because we didn't get into the actual rankings yet for the team total talent ratings. Right now, Michigan has the 6th most talented roster in the country. Right now, going into the season, this is the most points I started doing this for the 2017 season. This is right now the most talented roster Jim Harbaugh has had. Now, it's also maybe the youngest one he has had. It's even younger than the 2017 team. But in terms of overall talent, over the last 4 years, they've recruited 51 4- and 5-star recruits at Michigan under Jim Harbaugh. So this is the 6th most talented roster going into this coming season. But it's really young. And so it's one of those things, Mark, where it's either all going to gel together and shock people. And that's kind of what happened with Georgia in 2017. Nobody really saw them coming. They all just kind of gelled at the same time. Or it's going to get them fired because they'll just the schedule they're playing is difficult. So they're either going to get crushed under the weight of that schedule, or they're all going to kind of gel. It's not a team where like one unit is holding them back. And you're like, okay, if they get better corner play, the whole team is literally a start over. The whole team is. Now, there's a lot of raw material there, but it's a new defensive coordinator. It's an unproven offensive coordinator. He did the Brian Kelly 2016 coaching staff reboot thing to save his career. This is really everything about this program, other than the presence of Harbaugh, is totally a brand new program. So they're either going to catch fire and shock people, which they did a little bit Jim's first year, or you're going to see them with all that newness, with the level of schedule they're playing, it's going to collapse them, and he's going to get fired.
So for people that believe in the sheer recruiting rankings, which I do generally, you have to take it within context, because I think the Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama triumvirate at the top makes total sense because they're taking the best talent and they're also coaching them up to give us the best results on the field. Then you've got a bunch of underachievers that are collecting hordes of talent.
Yeah.
Like your guy at Michigan, to a certain extent. He's only coming off the rails for the one season. Before that, it was
they weren't off the rails. They just didn't meet expectations. They were kind of in this lukewarm hell. Yeah.
But to look at your ratings, I was surprised to see a number of teams. So, of course, Texas is there in the top 8 in the nation, and they haven't certainly resulted in that kind of ranking at the end of the season. But Cal shows up. I was surprised to see Cal there. I was surprised to see UCLA and Purdue in the top 25 in the rankings.
One of the things that I've noticed that this metric favors over the years is stability in coaching. Because especially now with the early signing period, Bud Elliott, 24/7 Sports, has a really interesting feature out today about how the early signing period is really hurting teams that make coaching changes, because it's right smack dab in the middle of when you're making a decision whether or not to make a coaching change. And so even the speculation is upsetting, which is another reason, going back to the previous question, if I'm Michigan, if it's even close, I'm starting McCarthy, because he's the reason they held that recruiting class together. But the early signing period is really setting coaching hires back. And so stability at coaching matters quite a bit. And they've had it at Cal now for the last few years. That should be a team poised to finish somewhere in the first, within a winning record and competitive in the Northern Division. That doesn't mean that I think that they're as good as Oregon, who I have as the 4th most talented roster in the country right now. But Cal should be a team. And remember, a lot of people had him in the top 25 heading into last year. They just ran into a bunch of COVID nonsense. That should be a team that should be able to win, 6, 7, or 8 games in the Pac-12 this fall.
Now, while Steve addresses the next topic, I'm going to ask you, Steve, so I can get this link in the chat. Where can we find your ratings?
I have not put them up on a website yet, actually. Okay. So they're mentioned prevalently in last week's episode of Bigger Ten, if you want to go back and watch that. They're mentioned prevalently in this week's episode of Michigan Podcast, when I compare Michigan's numbers to the rest of their league, but I haven't put it up on a site yet.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to keep talking here, and while Steve's addressing an issue or a topic, I'm going to grab that if I can and get it in the live chat. So check out the ratings right there. You're going to see Nebraska there in the top 25. Wisconsin and Nebraska are like this in terms of the ratings, but of course Wisconsin is performing. Wisconsin, they are just the gold standard when it comes to playing past their talent. It's just remarkable what they've done generation after generation since Barry Alvarez got that thing running in 1993. All right. Trevor Emmerich is asking about Indiana. Of course, they had a fine season 2 years ago with a bowl appearance, an 8-5 season, played much better last year despite the bowl loss. Where you think they're headed, and if what the ratings are telling us about IU.
Well, this time last year at Indiana with a top 25 overall most talented roster in the country. There are several iterations of this. They get updated after NFL declarations, signing days, spring ball, then right before camps begin. At one point last offseason, I had Indiana, the 15th most overall talented roster in the country. So I was on them going into the season based on my numbers. This year, my numbers have them somewhere around the 9th or 10th most talented roster in the Big Ten. I think they've lost quite a bit. Now, they do have Michael Penix coming back. That's a big weapon, given the position he played, as you noted, Mark. But he's also coming off an ACL, and mobility is a big part of his game. So is he all the way back or not? They lost some key guys at receiver. They lost the bell cow there at tailback as well. So there's going to be a lot different supporting cast around him. They're also not going to sneak up on everybody. A lot of people realize now Indiana is good. I kind of view Indiana as the inverse in a way of the conversation we just had about Michigan, where I've got them right now with, they went from a top 25 roster in the country to a roster that I think is less talented than Michigan State's, according to my numbers right now. And Michigan's got the 6th most talented roster in the country. But which culture in the program do you trust more right now? Jim Harbaugh's or Tom Allen's? Because he's got a playmaking quarterback, even if it takes him a few weeks into the season to get his legs back, I think you and I are pretty confident that if Michael Penix starts 10 or 11 games this fall, Indiana will find some way to get into the postseason, right? Can you and I say right now, 100%, given the schedule Michigan's playing and the uncertainty of youth on this roster, that somehow Michigan's playing somewhere in the postseason? I don't think that we can. And that's because in 7 years, one guy hasn't built a culture, and in 4 years, another guy has.
I don't know what my predictions are going to be. I would not be surprised if Michigan had a better year than Indiana. But yes, I am more sure about Indiana's season than Michigan's season.
Yes. What we're saying is Indiana's ceiling is not nearly as high as Michigan's. Its floor, though, is much higher. Yeah.
So I got to think with Indiana having a top 15 roster, according to your ratings, the last 2 years, or last year going into 2020, that had much to do with player performance, not the original recruiting rankings.
Correct. Yep. Ty Freifogel, Stevie Smith, or Stevie Scott. All those
guys.
Even Michael Penix. All these guys all outplayed their recruiting rankings. Yes. But they also had stability there, which means they didn't have a lot of it. Now, this may be about to change with the new transfer rule, but that's the other reason, going back to Cal a minute ago, continuity is favored in my metric because you have the least amount of attrition typically with the most continuity. One of the things I've noticed in my ratings every year is the Big 12 scores lower as a composite than any conference every year. And I realized in year 2, it's because they take more junior college players than any other conference does per capita. And so those are guys that are leaving after 1 or 2 years. And there's less continuity there. So this is a system that definitely highlights continuity in your program.
I don't know if my comment here in response to that makes any sense mathematically, but I would think with a smaller conference, only 10 teams, that would be less likely to happen. To have bottom feeders that would drag down the ratings for the conference.
Yeah, but if you look at the recruiting rankings this year, for example, the Big 12 doesn't have any top 10 recruiting classes. Oklahoma's 11th, but they don't have any. I think Oklahoma and Texas are the only 2 teams in the league in like 20 years to post top 20 or top 10 recruiting classes. So it's a league where the bottom is there's not much of a bottom there, but there's a pretty deep middle of teams that tend to carve each other up quite a bit.
Got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast, also his channel, The Bigger 10. Check them both out. Again, it's Michigan Podcast and it's The Bigger 10. I'm going to get the link to a recent show in which you can check out his total team talent ratings. The Rod Farva back on the Michigan beat. And I guess, Steve, if there's one thing that we can credit Jim Harbaugh for over the last year and a half, is that he pulled together a nice recruiting class here, even with all the uncertainty and all the groundwork that needs to be laid during the time in which there was speculation about his job status. He pulls in a top 10 class. So the Rod Favre is asking, do you think hiring a younger and more diverse coaching staff will help in recruiting? How much does the lack of experience hurt recruiting?
I think, this, you mentioned this class. I mean, top 10 classes, this is, I think, their fourth or fifth since Harbaugh's been there. So they're one of the 14 teams. Athlon Sports has the stat that 26 of the 28 teams to make the college football playoffs so far were teams that the 4 years leading up to the season averaged a top 15 recruiting class. That's 14 teams heading into this year. Michigan is the 12th of those 14 teams. So I don't know that recruiting was a huge problem. This class I like actually more than any of his previous ones. And the reason why is this is the first time, Mark, since Michigan's last number one overall class, 1998, coming off the national championship year, that they recruited both a five-star quarterback and running back in the same class. That was Justin Fargas and Drew Henson. And this year they did it with J.J. McCarthy and Donovan Edwards. I also think there's some playmakers at other places. I think Xavier Worthy is the fastest receiver recruit Michigan has signed since at least Steve Breston, and maybe going back even further. So I like the top end playmaking ability of this class is probably the best of any class overall that Harbaugh has brought in. Now, regarding the question about the younger staff, I think that they've got to win enough games this fall for that to matter. They're off to a good start for the 2022 class. I don't know how many slots they have left, because this is a young team where a lot of these guys are going to be back next year. But ultimately, for that future investment from that younger staff in recruiting, for that to pay off, they've got to win enough games this year to survive the season, to be the coaches next year. And I think that's the issue more than anything else. I don't think recruiting has been Michigan's problem. No, they're not recruiting at Ohio State's level. Frankly, Michigan on a regular routine basis, even when it's been at its top, at the top, never has. And that the problem isn't beating Ohio State. That's the ultimate disappointment. But the problem is they only went 3-3 against the Michigan State program, scuffling bad down the stretch of the D'Antonio era. They just lost to Mel Tucker. He's got a losing record to James Franklin. He's been absolutely housed 3 out of the last 4 years by Wisconsin. And the last 2 years were, frankly, nationally televised embarrassments to the program. That's the issue, Mark. And we're not even to the argument at Michigan yet about why can't you beat Ohio State. We're not even the next team after Ohio State yet. We're not even that team yet. We got to separate from all those other teams before we can even have that argument. In 7 years, he's not even been able to do that.
You basically hit on this next question that Vinay is asking about the gap between Ohio State and Michigan being talent, coaching, or culture, and the combination of such.
I think I would, if I had to guess, if you took those three things, I would say it's 20% talent, meaning that Ohio State has another layer of playmaker that Michigan has not had. But then I go to 20% coaching, because if Donovan Peoples-Jones, Michigan and Ohio State were his final two schools, if that young man signs with Ohio State, does he get, 60 catches in a career? Mark, does he do that at Ohio State for his entire 3 years there? Hell no, he doesn't do that. So I think it's 20% coaching. I think it's 20% recruiting. And I think it's 60% the culture at Michigan. Jim Harbaugh's just never established a college culture. They do a great job of acquiring talent and sending it off to the NFL, but they just don't win for Michigan anymore. They're just that esprit de corps, that culture. See, to me, that was Urban Meyer's missing. That was the part that's been underrated about what he did at Ohio State. Is we saw at Florida, his 2010 class at Florida was the highest rated recruiting class in the history of recruiting services until this Alabama class. But he couldn't compile those guys into a cohesive culture, and then ultimately had so many problems off the field, and he had health problems and resigned. What he did at Ohio State is he learned from that mistake and realized that I cannot be an NFL farm team and a national champion, that I've got to build a college program here. And I think that's the issue. How many Michigan players when they get married, are going to ask Jim Harbaugh to be one of their groomsmen? But how many guys are going to ask Urban Meyer to be one of theirs? How many how many of your guys are going to ask Jim Tressel to be theirs? I think that's the issue here. That we don't have a culture. We just have a brand. It's just Jim Harbaugh. And I think that's what's got to be corrected. And the fact we're having this conversation in year 7 is a damn tragedy.
And that's one of the great confirmations of what Robert Knight accomplished at IU, while the rest of us sit on the sideline and think this guy's insane. He's a maniac, and we're correct in a lot of ways. His players vouched for him, and they loved him. The Rod Favre also asking one thing that needs to happen in Michigan. So I'm going to paraphrase this question because I've delved into this a little bit myself, because I'm the last guy, or try to be the last guy, that is conjecturing what's going on between people's ears. I hate the sideline reports that this team looks confident, they don't look confident, all this other business, but just because a few guys are jumping up and down and other guys are hanging their heads a little bit. I think everybody's different. But at the same time, is Jim Harbaugh a different coach? Does he coach differently? Has he lost fire, passion, all those things, or is that overblown?
I'm probably not qualified to answer most of that question because we're not there. And that's the other thing Michigan does. I mean, frankly, the Michigan football program is more secure than our southern border. So no one knows what goes on there on the inside. All we know is you don't see him at the NFL draft with his players like you see Nick Saban and you see Urban Meyer and a lot of those other guys. You don't see stuff like that. All we know, here's what I can tell you, watching every Michigan football game that's been played live or on tape since 1969, is from a demeanor standpoint, he's nowhere near the coach he was 3 or 4 years ago. It's not even close.
Because I still defend the guy's track record, because up until 2017, it was remarkable at every stop what he accomplished. So was 2017 the first time you saw an inexcusable loss at Michigan? Was that when those started?
I mean, I think a lot of us knew that was going to be the whole year in the roster, right? Okay, because that was the year that everybody knew for weeks Brady Hoke was gone. And then we had this long coaching search because we had to hire an AD too, and we had an interim AD, and essentially we put the whole thing on pause, hoping to get Jim Harbaugh, and didn't get an answer until almost New Year's. So that recruiting class was wrecked. And so I think a lot of us knew we had 19 guys off that 2016 team that ended up in NFL training camps the next summer. I think a lot of us knew that 2017 team was going to be the roster whole year. He did a great job plugging those holes the next year, grabbing Shea Patterson. So to me, the program was broken Urban Meyer's final game in Columbus, Ohio. Michigan came into that game in the top 4 for the playoff. Ohio State should have lost the previous week to Maryland. Probably should have lost that game a couple of times, actually. And then if they had, Michigan wouldn't have needed to win the game to win the division. They already would have won it. And Ohio State didn't just win, but it's the most emasculating, embarrassing loss I've ever suffered as a Michigan fan. I mean, the image of, we're still doing 5-step drop play action passes on 3rd and 8 down by 30. It was ball crushing. And I don't think the program has recovered from that. I don't. I think Urban Meyer, the previous week, I think Tom Allen kind of exposed with crossing routes how to take Don Brown's offense apart. And the next week, Urban Meyer's like, we got a hell of a lot better wide receivers than Indiana does. So we're going to do that all day. And then everybody realized that they could do that from that time forward. And then they fixed the crossing route thing, but then that opened up other things. And it just became Don Brown, the little Dutch girl plugging the holes in a leaky dike. But that 2018 game, that's the game that I think has irrevocably wrecked the program under Harbaugh, barring a miracle.
I'm right there with you. I think there are 2 watershed moments for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan. There are many, but if you want to size it down to 2, is the 2016 game, because obviously that could have been the push right through to a playoff.
Sure.
You don't assume the win in Indianapolis, but they were the better team against Wisconsin. So they get to a college football playoff. They beat Ohio State. They check all the boxes, boom, on one measurement. So that's a gut punch to a certain extent, but at that point, the program was ascending. So
sure. Only year 2.
It's like a momentary, but gut punch in terms of we should have had it this year, but man, we're on the right track. We're right there with them. Boom, we outplayed them today, and we haven't done that in years. So boom, we're right there. We're ready to go. We're on the right track. Versus what we saw in 2018. Here we are then 2 years later, and by all measurements, Michigan was the better football team going into the game, even though they had the same records at 10-1. I remember breaking down the 5 common opponents and saying Michigan's completely outplayed Ohio State against these 5 common opponents. It's not even close. Ohio State's struggling against the likes of Maryland in overtime, messing around with the Terps on the road and beating Nebraska by 1 score, a 4-8 team, and on and on and on. And Michigan's dominating these teams, gave up less than 100 yards of total offense to Michigan State that year. And they're the better team, but it's easy to afterwards. That sounds ridiculous. Of course, Ohio State's going to win. That's all we heard after the final score was posted. That everybody, well, of course, everybody should know this was going to happen. Well, the evidence was that was not going to happen, and so that was the gut punch, and that was where I got to think Jim Harbaugh is scratching his head, thinking, "What do I have to do? I don't have any more answers." And then finally, when that was replicated the next year, again, between 2 teams where Ohio State was decidedly better, but they shouldn't beat Michigan by 4 touchdowns. They're a 9-3 team. It just shouldn't have been that decided.
Mark, he's been here for 6 seasons. He has failed to recruit a quarterback that got drafted in the NFL. He has no wins against Ohio State. He has won 1 game in his career here where he was a point spread underdog, and he was a 1-point underdog to Notre Dame in 2019 in that driving rainstorm. Okay, they have not won the division. They've not been to Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game. He has no major bowl wins. If he was not arguably the greatest quarterback in school history, who finished 3rd for the Heisman Trophy, he'd have been fired, Mark. Even if he had been a quarterback here, but not that good, just okay, he'd have been fired. Jim Harbaugh is the coach at Michigan right now, not because of what he's done the last 6 years, but because of what he did at Michigan in 1986. That's why.
Steve, we've got all sorts of folks in the chat trying to make money off you, asking for national championship predictions and final.
I'll take as many of them as I can. Shoot, let's go.
Well, this is what I'm guessing. Number 1, you can join Steve on Patreon as well. What do you got available over there?
Right now, my whole focus is college hoops right now. And it's a crazy year. You know, I use the same system of analytics and situational handicapping. And one night I'll go 1-5, the next night 5-1, man. It's nuts, because you would think there'd actually be more certainty without all the fans in the stands and intimidating the refs and the home court advantage. It's the exact opposite, actually. It makes things even more unpredictable now, because on a given night, you don't even know when somebody has home court advantage or not. Okay, so it's a crazy year in college basketball. So all my handicapping I'm doing on the Michigan Podcast Patreon page right now is just for that. And plus, I'm enjoying hitting on the Buccaneers 12-1 to win the Super Bowl, of course.
But you'll eventually, obviously, get to the college football predictions, of course. So join Steve on Patreon.
I've already got down. I'm already down on the record. 10-1 odds on Georgia. In college basketball, I'm sitting on 40-1 Michigan to win the NCAA tournament. I got that before the season. So yeah, futures are what I love to do the most. And the reason why is because the variance evens out over the course of a long season. Where on a game-to-game basis, the lines are much tougher to beat. But over the course of a long season, those markets, in my view, are a lot softer. My record in college football futures for our Patreon supporters the last 3 years has been really good. My record in NFL futures the last few years for our Patreon supporters, I pick over win totals over under for every NFL team. I think I'm like 59% combined in the last 3 years. And you're talking about a league where every year 5 new playoff teams emerge. So futures are kind of my, my wheelhouse. I had the Nats 23-1 to win the World Series last year, as you recall. You probably heard me brag about that a few times.
That's all right. When you hit them, you got to brag, of course.
Sure.
These folks on here hear from me all the time when I hit on things like 30-12 against the spread in Super Bowls.
Yes.
But anyway, we got you for like 2 minutes. I have one other question about your ratings. So if we shut off the transfer portal tomorrow, nothing changed in terms of rosters, no injuries to spring camp, anything. Regardless of what you saw, felt about a particular team, everything would stay the same from now until game one.
No, because I after spring and I see which fifth years are back and who are not, then I go in and assess the extra bonus for players that I've not accounted for yet. Okay. Meaning the developmental players. I've not given developmental players that deserve a move up. I've not given them the move up yet. And that'll be the very last thing I will do for the very final talent ratings that I'll put out in July.
So people are asking for playoff teams.
But it's a little bit like a college football program right now. Every college football team, about 80% of your roster right now for next fall. All right, there's going to be some guys are going to leave, a few guys will leave, maybe a couple guys come in, a couple guys get hurt, but the foundation of every college football team roster is known right now. We're just talking about the last 10 to 15% of players, and that's kind of how this is. It won't move things all that much. Wisconsin might go up a couple of points. All right, that kind of a program. And Iowa might go up a couple of points, that kind of a program. But overall, it won't. The overall narrative that you're looking at today, once we get past the next wave of transfers in the spring, some schools like Oklahoma on purpose took small recruiting classes this year so that they could be aggressive in the transfer portal. They've already taken 2 or 3 kids away from Tennessee. I anticipate they'll take 2 or 3 or 4 more. That's the stuff that will change here in the next few months.
I've left the link to some recent broadcasts from Steve on the Bigger Ten and on the Michigan podcast, where you should be able to find his ratings breakdown of the top 25. Again, this is the potential of the rosters. This is a ratings of the talent and the potential. All right, Steve, where do we stand on this? I'll keep you for as long as you can go. But,
let's do like a lightning round, then I'll bolt. You said you got some questions and stuff. I'll do a lightning round.
Well, people want to know.
5 minutes, I'll get as many of them as I can.
People want to know your Final Four and your national champion.
It's too early for that yet.
Absolutely.
It's too early for that yet. What I would say is I'd be very surprised, despite the losses, that Alabama were not there. Alabama, I have them the most talented roster in the country by 30 points. I've never had a team with that kind of advantage over the rest of college football. So with that amount of raw material and the greatest coach ever, I got to think they're going to fashion a playoff team out of that. I think Clemson will absolutely be a playoff team, given where they stand. And I think DJ, is it Ungalele? I believe that's how it's pronounced, something like that.
You're there. Yep.
We saw what he could do. He's not Trevor Lawrence. He's a first-round draft pick. So he might not be Andrew Luck good, but he's going to be, Mac Jones, top 15 pick good. And they return every single starter on the defensive side of the football. So I think those two teams are there. I'm very intrigued, as I mentioned, by Georgia. I think they potentially have the number 1 overall draft pick the next year. I think 3 guys right now, Sam Howell at North Carolina, Spencer Rattler at Oklahoma, and JT Daniels at Georgia. One of those 3 guys will be the number 1 pick in next year's NFL draft. So they have the highest rated quarterback they've had at Georgia in I don't know how long. They're always good on defense. They return, I think, their top 4 or 5 receivers. I think Florida has a down year with their losses. I think Tennessee is plunging with the coaching change. I think they're running that East Division. And I think so it's a matter of, for Georgia, it really comes down to this for Georgia. They need to beat Clemson week 1 of the season. If they do that, and then if they are undefeated and lose to Alabama in the SEC championship game, they're still getting in the playoff. So that Clemson game for Georgia at the first of the year, that's like a play-in game for them. Clemson can lose it, still win the ACC, and they're getting in. I think Georgia needs to win that game. That's Alabama insurance for them. So and then Ohio State, I don't think they'll be as good as they've been the last couple of years, but I also think they're better. How do I explain this? I think this coming team will not be as good as last year's team was. Okay. And we mentioned the 2018 team, or the 2019 and 20 teams. This team, I don't think will be as good as those 2 teams were. But I think the gap between them and the rest of the Big Ten is wider than it was in 2019 and 2020. Does that make sense what I'm trying to explain?
Sure. So the conference is down.
If I were power rating this Ohio State team, it would be behind the last 2. But I would power rate them way ahead of the rest of the Big Ten. Interesting game for them, that Oregon game early in the year. Georgia, Clemson, Oregon, Ohio State, 4 of the top 5 teams I think you'll see in the preseason AP poll all play each other the first 2 weeks of the season. So I think that those 4 teams, and then what happens with Oklahoma, where they get Iowa State at home, but it doesn't matter home and away. Matt Campbell's covered the point spread against Oklahoma every single year. So I think the winner of the Iowa State-Oklahoma game, what happens with Oregon, and then those 4 teams that are there every year, your playoff teams are out of that array of teams I just mentioned.
So two quick hitters involving Michigan football, micro and macro here. One would be the running back room was devoid of talent and just thin leading into 2019. Zach Charbonnet gets the 33 carries, scores 11 touchdowns. A year and a half later, he's barely on the field and he's out of the program at UCLA. So what happened there?
Totally mismanaged by Jay Harbaugh, the running backs coach. Just mismanaged. And I think that's why Mike Hart was brought in to be the running backs coach, and the coach's son was moved to tight ends and special teams. That was just mismanaged. Now, this year's running back room is stacked. That's the most loaded position on the team. I think Hassan Haskins is like a miniature Leroy Horde. Blake Corum has a level of he's not the typical type of tailback that a Michigan gets. Typically see a guy like that. You know, it kind of reminds me of a little bit. He's not as powerful, but he reminds me a little bit of a J.K. Dobbins kind of a guy. That's not typically the kind of tailback Michigan gets. Donovan Edwards is the best tailback the state of Michigan high school ranks has produced, at least since Mikey Weber. He's probably a better prospect than him. So, I mean, they're pretty loaded at that position again for this fall.
And then we've got Harbaugh with the new contract. The opening line of the statement at the news conference was, "This is the guy we still believe that is going to win championships at Michigan." So what does he have to do in year one? Is it win or bust, or is it we just need to see improve? Do you have any idea on what the standard's going to be?
I think that fan perception of this is going to drive a lot of it. We saw former players come out. You know, Charles Woodson said last year, "My son doesn't even want to watch Michigan play anymore." Brian Greasy tweeted, "Enough is enough," after the Penn State game. There's a fissure there. He doesn't have gravitas with the former player network and the donor network anymore, where you wouldn't dare speak ill of the king. He's lost that cachet. So I think that it's totally subjective. Some things we know for sure. If they have a losing record, if they're 6-6, he's gone. What if they're 7-5 and they play Ohio State tough at the end? And JJ McCarthy showed a lot of promise as a young quarterback. What if they're 8-4, but then they play Ohio State tough at the end? Or what if they're 9-3, but they get 40 burgered by Ohio State again and ran off the field, and that's the last taste in everybody's mouth? Those are all scenarios that I think Ward Manuel will do one of these numbers and gauge which way the wind blows. And I think you'll have to ask me that question closer to time. But if I had to guess, given the amount of newness in the program and the difficulty of the schedule, in my opinion, I think the program collapses under the weight of those two things, or it's a 2018, 1985, when Jim played, 2018, a couple of years ago, kind of season that nobody had Michigan pegged as a national team heading into the season, and they turned out to be. I think it will be one of those two things. I really don't think this is going to be some 7-5 and we're not sure team. I don't think middling is going to be the issue. I think they either catch fire or they're on fire.
It looks middling to me, but that's actually the number I had in my head when we taped the other day was 7-5. Just looking at the schedule and looking at the talent and trying to make the comparison there. But I understand we either go off the rails or you hit something and you catch the momentum and you go.
Mark, you're right about your assessment, but you can't just do an assessment with Michigan because the culture's not there. That's why I think they either catch fire, they got the right group of guys together with the right players, and it clicks, right? Okay, that either happens, or they're all looking at each other like that Spider-Man gif where the Spider-Mans are all pointing at each other. Okay, they're doing that all season, or we rally around the flag. This is not a stable program, Mark, where we just look at the personnel and the schedule and then apply the personnel to the schedule and make a projection. It's not a stable program there. They're terraforming in real time right now.
If you love college football analysis and you don't get on over to Michigan Podcast, regardless of who you root for, if you just like to hear a smart take, head on over there and Bigger 10 right here on YouTube. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by as always, sir.
You bet. Go Blue, everybody. And thanks for having me, Mark. Good to see you, brother, as always.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I will let everyone know that we're talking Florida State football at the top of the hour. And then we're here a little bit later tonight for our call-in show at 8 o'clock Eastern time. So we'll see you then.
All right, man. Good stuff.